Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm KM Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There's no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. My name is KM Weiland, and I run the writing website Helping Writers Become Authors. And today we're going to be talking about how to troubleshoot your ending. So this is in response to a couple of questions that I received about endings. One is from Aisha Ali. How about some posts about crafting endings? I just reached the end of a manuscript, and I realized that my character arc and themes weren't strong enough to craft a compelling ending. I wrote as much as I could and jotted the last few lines I've been holding on to, but filed it away to look at in another few months. So how do you know if you have a strong enough arc or not? How do you decide which bits go in the climax? How do you structure on a smaller level those beats? And how do you avoid the climax being a string of sequel scenes and explanation? And then another question was from Esther Gonzalez Bertrand. I would like to know more about how to outline a good ending and how to write a beginning that is reflected in the ending, or is it the other way around? So over the last couple months in the last few videos, we've talked about beginnings and the importance of setting up character and plot in the beginnings. And we touched a little bit on how setting up the beginning is always something that you're kind of thinking about as you're building into the ending. If you know the ending, that can help you set up the beginning, and vice versa. If you've done a really good job in the beginning, you can then bring that full circle by the time you get to your story's finale. So the most important thing to understand about troubleshooting your story's ending is that if the ending doesn't work, the ending probably is not the problem. The problem is probably that things weren't set up in the right way in previous scenes. And this could be just maybe the third act isn't working, but it could also be something that goes all the way back to the first act and to the beginning. So you really have to kind of take a bird's eye view of what your story, how it's coming together structurally, and how that's building into the ending that you want to create. Because it is important to kind of hold this idea in your head that the ending is in the beginning. So whatever you write in the beginning, even if it's very far away from wherever your characters get to in the ending, and even in some instances, if you don't know yet what's going to happen in the ending, whatever you've set up there, whatever seeds you've planted, even down to the imagery sometimes that's set up, that is what is going to create the cohesion and the resonance that needs to come full circle in your story's ending. So if your ending isn't working, it's either because it wasn't the ending that was actually set up in the beginning, or because the beginning and subsequent parts of your story failed to set up the ending that you want to have happen by the time you get there in your story. So again, it's like the problem with endings usually isn't something that's happening in isolation, but it's important to understand what is the function of the ending, right? So what are you trying to build toward throughout your story's entire structure? And the point of the ending simply is that in the climactic moment, your character is your protagonist is going to definitively end their relationship to the plot goal. So very often this is because they definitively gain the plot goal, whatever it is they've been seeking throughout the entire story. It could also be that the antagonist definitively gains the plot goal, keeping the protagonist from having it. And in other stories, it can be perhaps that the protagonist has it within their reach, but they choose to let it go because of their character arc and how they've evolved over the course of the story. They realize this is no longer in alignment with who they are and who they've become, so they choose to let it go. But regardless, they no longer are in pursuit of this plot goal that they have been moving toward throughout the story. And as a result, there is no longer any reason for there to be obstacles between them and that plot goal. That's what creates the conflict. And once you have no conflict, you no longer have a plot, no story, the story's at an end. So that is the purpose and the focus of your story's ending. It is the climactic moment and how it definitively determines whether or not your protagonist will get the plot goal that they've been chasing throughout the entire story. So once you know that, that allows you to look back over your story's entire structure, and particularly the main structural beats. So you're going to want to kind of pull those out and look at them in isolation. So we're talking about things like the inciting event and the first plot point, the midpoint, and the third plot point. And looking at those and making sure that they all have a thematic unity. They're all about the same thing, right? They're all specifically about the character's relationship to the plot goal that will be decided in the climactic moment. Your climactic moment is always going to tell you, it's going to prove what your story is really about. So if all of your structural moments have been about one thing, let's say they've been about a relationship plotline, and then you get to the climactic moment and it's about something else. It's about, catching a bad guy or something. Those don't match. That is an instance where the structural through line is mismatched and you're really trying to tell two different stories. And it's fine to have one of those stories as a subplot, but the climactic moment needs to be focused on whatever is the main structural through line, as proven by what's happening in all of the previous structural beats. So if that is a primary thing to look at if you feel like your ending isn't working or it's mismatched or the conflict's just kind of petered out, is it in alignment with everything that's come before? And by the same token, you can look at your theme and determine what that's really about by looking at the climactic moment. And in that moment, what is your protagonist's relationship to the thematic truth? In a positive change arc, they will have, grown into and embraced that truth. In a negative change arc, they will have grown away from it. In a flat arc, they will have maintained their relationship to it, but the characters around them will have evolved into an appreciation and understanding of it. So that will show you, too, what is your story about thematically. And again, you can look at all of the structural beats leading up to that to make sure that the same theme is showing up. That, again, you're not, proving one theme through the character's actions in earlier structural beats and then, highlighting something completely different by the time you get to the climactic moment, that you're able to achieve that cohesion and that resonance and that thematic unity throughout your entire story. Okay, so the question of, is your ending strong enough? That really depends on the particular story. How much of a punch your climactic moment packs really does depend on just the nature of the story and how dramatic it has been in general. Generally speaking, the greater the impact of the climactic moment, it's how definitively the character gets that goal. Because in some stories, it's actually pretty ambiguous, particularly like in series, what may be a definitive enough relationship to that goal at the end of book one is then going to be something that continues in the conflict in future books. And that's fine. And in other stories, it's purposefully ambiguous because it's trying to prove a point about, probably something to do with its theme. But in most stories, the more definitively your character ends their relationship with the plot goal, whether they get it or not, is going to determine how strong that ending feels to readers. And by the same token, how strong is their character arc? That's going to be largely determined by the tension that exists between the story's lie and truth. So in some stories, you have a very dramatic arc where the tension between these two things are complete opposites, right? It could be the characters moving from hate to love. And that's a huge arc, right? And then in other stories, it's much subtler. It could be something like they're moving from indifference to love or like to love. That's a little baby arc, right? And that's fine depending on the type of story. Not all stories want something that's extremely dramatic and, really, really punches through with this dramatic arc. So it really just depends on what's best for your story. What do you want to have happen? What do you want to accomplish? And knowing that and being able to judge by the time you get to the end whether or not you were able to accomplish that. Now, in regards to the idea that maybe your climax is suffering because it's a string of sequel scenes or reactions, the climax should never be sequels, reactions, or explanation, right? that is within scene structure, that is a sequel, that is a reaction part of the scene structure, and that is never the climax, right? The climax is like the sceniest scene in your entire story. So within classic scene structure, we can split scenes into two halves, which we call scene and sequel, which are action and reaction. And the action half of that scene is made up of goal, conflict, and outcome. And that is literally the climax, right? So it is the job of the resolution, the scenes that follow the climax, to show characters' reactions and finish up any explanations or loose ends that need to be shared. So if you feel like that's all that's happening in your climax is explanations and reactions, then either you're misidentifying what is really your climactic moment, which is, again, wherever the character definitively gets or loses the plot goal, or you've skipped it, like it doesn't exist, and you just kind of petered out with your story, in which case you can go back and identify what is your character's plot goal and how is that going to be resolved, and make sure you have a really strong scene that shows that to readers, right? The climax, above all, is not the place where you want to tell versus show. Okay, so one final thing to think about as you're troubleshooting your ending and trying to figure out where maybe the previous parts of the story went wrong so that they're not leading up to your ending in the way that you want, is to think about the idea of chiastic structure. So chiastic structure is where the two halves of the story mirror each other. So the beats in the first half mirror the beats in the second half in some way. And story structure is just naturally this way, in that the beats in the first half will set it up, whereas the beats in the second half will pay it off. And I've talked about this in depth on my site. I'll leave some resources down below. But you can take this a little further and do it a little more consciously, and specifically when it comes to your ending. And we talked about this a little bit in some of the previous videos about beginnings. But if you look at how specifically the hook in the very beginning of your story and the resolution in the very ending, how they mirror each other. So for instance, you have a characteristic moment in the beginning and the hook. You can mirror that in some way with another characteristic moment in the ending, in the resolution. But more to the point of what we're talking about today, you want to look to the inciting event, which happens around halfway through the first act, and is the call to adventure that sort of kicks off the character's pursuit of the plot goal, his interest in this. And how does that mirror what happens in the climactic moment? How does that set it up? You can think of the inciting event as a question that has to be answered by the time you get to the climactic moment. So those are just some things to think about. Obviously, endings are very complex. Well, I take that back. The endings are simple, right? The ending, you're funneling it down to one single point, which is the climactic moment. And that is actually quite a simple thing. But everything that's come before to lead up to this is very complex, right? Depending on your story. I mean, even the simplest novel, you've got chapters upon chapters and characters and themes, all of these loose ends that you're weaving that have to come together and funnel down into this one single point where everything that's come before makes sense and it has to do and is thematically related to this one point. So it's a lot to think about and consider. And we always say it's like it's one thing to hook readers with a good beginning, and it's another thing to hook them with a good ending, because then they will want to keep reading, right? It's not just about getting them to finish this one book, but convincing them, that you can give them a satisfying story experience so that they'll want to read on into the next book that you may be writing, whether it's in a series or not. So endings are, as we all know, extremely important. They prove whether or not a story works. Many a great story that people have enjoyed throughout, by the time they get to the end, they're upset by it in some way because it doesn't make sense or it doesn't work or they feel like the writer didn't play fair with them. So it's important to really understand the technical definition of what you're trying to accomplish with a story's ending, to understand how it functions structurally, and therefore how it's a part of the structure that leads up to that within both the plot, the character arc, and the theme, so that you can bring all of those things together in a really solid climactic moment that ends your story's conflict. So again, I hope that was helpful. If you have a question that you'd like me to consider for a future video, you can leave that down below. If you'd like to stay in touch with me and all the content that I produce, the best way to do that is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. I put out a in-depth text and podcast post every week, so you can keep in touch with that as well as these videos. And I will see you again later. Happy writing. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at author_KM_Weiland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/KM_Weiland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of helping writers become authors.